What's cooking, folks? Vermillion Phoenix here, and today we're here to drop another hero overview for Orcs Must Die Unchained. This time we're going to talk about Yi-Lin, the Wuxing hero, who adds a lot of very unique ideas to the game that literally didn't exist before. So join me as we go over her skills and abilities and sort of talk about the niche that she carves out for herself in the game. So Yi-Lin as a hero is extremely unique in the fact that, unlike a lot of other heroes where the majority of their abilities other than the primary attack have cooldowns so that they can't be used repeatedly or have some other limiting factor, Yi-Lin is essentially just an ability spamming machine. Her abilities, while costing a resource, her energy meter, are able to be chained back and forth into each other, and this replenishes the energy that she ultimately spends on them. Now you could just spam the abilities together, but if you want to maintain a constant pool of energy, once your energy is nearing a low point or you have spent a significant amount of it, you can just alternate your attacks to have it literally refilled during combat, which is extremely powerful and means that Yi-Lin feels like, for the most part, she has an infinite supply of energy. Now, couple this with the fact that of her abilities, all except one of them have no cooldown. So she's flinging abilities and blades left and right, and this allows her to deal a ton of damage up close. Now, while she can do all that, she also has the ability to slip out of combat and defend herself with her shift ability, which allows her to take less damage and also increases her movement speed. You can think of this sort of like Midnight's Prowl, only instead of her just being able to get out of the way with nobody aggroing her, she gets a defense bonus. So it's not necessarily the best version of this mechanic, but it is extremely useful and is something that should not be overlooked. And from there we hop into Yi-Lin's actual kit. Her primary attack is not particularly special on its own. It's a swiping attack from left to right. If you played a single melee hero in the game, you've pretty much seen it before. So it doesn't have super huge range. Like I said, it's pretty standard. It's not going to do a ton of damage, but the damage that it does is solid. But for Yi-Lin specifically, it serves a key purpose in that after any other attack, even if you're out of energy, this attack is always available to you, and you want to make sure that you remember to splice it in between other attacks to cause your energy to regen. Now, some people just like to spam out high damage attacks with her, and that works. Like, you'll deal a ton of damage very quickly that way, but if you do not keep present in your mind the need to make sure that her energy regenerates, then you'll quickly find that you'll be out of combat for a little while and basically lose damage strictly off the fact that you didn't manage your resources well. So generally, for most people starting out, I would recommend sort of just weaving this in between any of her other attacks to make sure that her energy stays at least well stocked, if not fully, and that way you'll be able to make sure that you use her pretty efficiently. From here, we'll move on to Yi-Lin's most important attack, her Imperial Reach. This ability has some issues with hitting enemies vertically. It is a flat line sort of a wave that sweeps out from her swords, and it does have some short range in front of her and slightly to the sides, so you can hit a small group of enemies with it. There's a weaver that enlarges that, so you're able to hit even more enemies. So it's good at dealing with small groups, and it's about the best AoE ability that she gets, so that makes it particularly important to her arsenal. But also, as enemies lose HP, its damage increases. I'm not sure what the upper limit of it is, but it is high, and because Yi-Lin has no cooldown, this ability can be spammed rapidly to accumulate a large block of damage on a small group of enemies very quickly. Think like being able to use maxes in your faces on multiple enemies at once if they're grouped up. It would be a very powerful ability, and that's sort of what Yi-Lin gets to do. So it's really good. I mean, there's really no two ways about it. It's a move that you want to take advantage of as often as possible, But because you can spam it, make sure that you keep an eye on your energy meter and make sure you take advantage of her passive to regenerate it quickly. That way you can sort of optimize your DPS and your playstyle with it. But yeah, if you're not using this move enough, you will probably think that her damage is a bit lackluster, so practice with it. But let's move on to the next ability. Yi-Lin's third ability is White Tiger Strike. White Tiger Strike is a sweeping attack that basically has the same range as Yi-Lin's normal attack, but causes a bleed on enemies or a periodic damage over time that increases her primary attack damage. Now the issue with this is that it won't really gain you any more damage than you'll get from Imperial Reach and doesn't have as much reach, so you're not going to be able to hit as many enemies with it. So it costing energy basically makes it not quite as good as it could be, though it does have its uses. For instance, damage over time abilities generally work really well against soldiers and any enemy that possesses the steady ability, as it allows you to deal damage over time, circumventing the damage reduction that they normally do to your attacks. So it's particularly good there, and I mentioned it a few times when I played with her. But otherwise, you're really going to want to avoid the ability, as it's really not the best way to deal damage, and it doesn't really offer anything other than that bleed or the increased primary attack damage. And her secondary attack is just so strong that spending the time to work White Tiger Strike into your rotations actually reduces your damage. So I'm not sure if the move really requires a buff, because the only thing you would do is allow her to deal more damage, but she already is pretty good. So yeah, the move just sits in a really weird place, but has its utility, so there. But then we move on to a more interesting ability. Yi-Lin's fourth ability is Tempest Trike. Tempest Strike starts off with a vacuum or pull that will drag any nearby enemies into Yi-Lin's location, followed by a number of sweeping attacks with her blades. The move lasts for, I believe, about 2.2 seconds, but it only pulls once. It allows you to deal a good amount of damage to any enemies that are nearby, and you can pull enemies that might be moving past Yi-Lin back to her, so that you'll get a couple of extra attacks off, and it can save you from maybe losing a rift point or having anything run to a really unfortunate location while you're fighting. Either way, it's a pretty solid ability, but this is her only ability that has a cooldown. Because of that, you won't be using it very often. I mean, it has a pull, can't really leave crowd control without any cooldowns, and for the most part, it does a really good job at helping her handle crowds more than the rest of her abilities, just due to the pull itself. That said, there is a Weaver that you can grab that allows you to use it more often, so it's still not bad. Probably not going to be quite as useful as Imperial Reach, however, just due to the fact that you can deal damage faster with Imperial Reach. This is really just a tool for dealing with really large groups of enemies, or when you get surrounded, as the pull allows you to basically move through enemies and get away, as well as dealing a lot of damage to anything that's directly around you, but not as much damage as Imperial Reach. So there's always that pressure or contemplation about whether or not you want to use other abilities than Imperial Reach because of the sheer amount of damage you can do. So the rest of your moves really boil down to utility, like, do I need to do this to get my energy back? And Tempest Strike, due to its cooldown, basically winds up, at least in my opinion, a bit underused, but don't overlook it in key situations because it can be useful. And now we can just talk about Yi-Lin's passive and her movement ability. Yi-Lin's passive is what we're going to touch on first, and it's Moon's Reflection. Whenever Yi-Lin makes contact with an attack and then uses another attack that makes contact with an enemy as well, that contact is important because if you miss, you get nothing. She regenerates a small portion of her HP over time, and this can be refreshed as long as your attacks are rotating or alternating in some way. And she immediately gets back a small portion of energy. So the energy is probably the most important part. There's also a Weaver that can boost the energy production from this, which makes it all the more powerful. And it's really just a really solid passive overall. It gives Yi-Lin a lot of staying power in combat. As long as the enemies are not dealing insane amounts of damage to you, you're actually able to sustain yourself quite well, and you can get into fights with less HP than most characters would comfortably and actually come out on top based on how you decide to chain your attacks. And it also means that sometimes you can go into a fight and come out healthier for no reason other than you actually decided to go into combat. Unlike a character like, say, Blackpaw, who needs to make sure that he has certain abilities not on cooldown, Yi-Lin can basically go in and rotate everything and essentially has no cooldowns. So it's a very interesting situation, but sometimes you can still be in a situation where it's not really safe, or Moon's Reflection isn't regenerating your HP fast enough for remaining in combat to remain viable. Then her Jade Sentinel movement ability comes in. So Jade Sentinel removes her ability to attack. You cannot attack at all while in this form, but you gain a damage reduction, which I believe the base amount is 30%, and you move faster. This increased movement allows you to get out of combat quickly, and it allows you to travel from different points on the map faster than you would without it. So it has its uses, and it doesn't take long to get into or out of the form, but you won't be able to immediately attack during the short transition. It's important to understand that the form is useful for movement and when you have to move through enemies that might be attacking you. So make sure you take account of what you need to do. If you need to make sure that you don't take a lot of damage while you're doing something, which is always a good idea, but also don't need to attack enemies in any key positions while you're traveling, then it's a good idea to move around in Jade Sentinel form. But that's all of her actual activated abilities, movement, and passive. We can talk more now about some other character ideas, and more specifically, her upgrades. So here are Yi-Lin's Weavers. At tier 1, we have Generous Moon, Inspiring Moon, and Healing Moon. Generally speaking, Generous Moon is not going to be picked unless you're in multiplayer. There's pretty much no reason for it, and that's the only time you will be able to get any sort of benefit, and it sort of turns into a team heal if you're playing with a group of melee heroes. Anything other than that, you really won't be able to use it as well, as it doesn't last for a particularly long period of time, so you'll have to fight in close quarters, and that can be a little tricky at times. Other than that, it's not too horrible. Inspiring Moon increases the amount of energy that you're going to generate whenever Yi-Lin alternates her attacks. This is really big if you are a happy spammer of Imperial Reach. It will allow you to regenerate your energy quicker, ultimately meaning more damage because you can get back to spamming the real damage move as soon as you get the opportunity. And then Healing Moon. Healing Moon is probably going to be the de facto pick most of the time when you're playing solo if you are not a fan of Inspiring Moon, just because really there's not too many things outside of Endless that really need that much damage being dealt to them, and it helps to sustain you longer, which makes it a lot easier to stay alive in those big fights when you're surrounded or there's just a huge wave of enemies. But that at tier 1 is all pretty solid. Good uses for most of the Weavers, although Generous Moon, due to the game's population, probably won't see nearly as much utility. But it might see some use in things like Sabotage, due to just being able to help keep your teammates alive, although depending on whether or not you have a more apt support character, they may be better off at keeping your team topped off, leaving you to either deal the damage or just help sustain yourself a little bit better. Either way, again, good choices. Let's move on to tier 2. Yi-Lin's tier 2 Weavers feature a particular outlier, something that is just hands down probably the best thing in the list, and that's going to be Element of Surprise. Element of Surprise increases the width and the range of Imperial Reach. That means it's going to hit wider and go farther, ultimately meaning you hit more enemies and score more damage, because it is already the powerhouse in damage out of her skill set. There's absolutely no reason not to improve her best move. However, the other two moves or upgrades that she has available here are not bad. It's just that they get eclipsed by how useful Element of Surprise is. So then we have the Element of Speed. It increases the movement speed of Jade Sentinel, has a flat 30% increase by default, the Weaver increases it by another 15%, basically making it 50% faster overall as far as the buff goes. It's not bad, but you really only want to use this if you have trouble moving around and you really have no other way to sort of band-aid that problem on larger maps, such as no stable hand guardian, no speed pads, and there's just not enough speed pads on the map with the way that it's set up for you already. So that's something to consider. Just the problem is you lose out on other Weavers that are a bit stronger in this case, and that's really the only detriment. I mean, it's not a bad Weaver, it's just that by comparison, there are some very strong options at this level. And then we move on to the element of Renewal. Now, this is a Weaver that allows Tempest Trike to be used more often. Every time you trigger Moon's Reflection, it takes 2 seconds off the cooldown. By default, I believe it's around 22 seconds. So that means that it will take you about somewhere between 6 to 8, depending on how heavily grouped the enemies are, 6 to 8 rotations before the time normally counts itself down and you can use Tempest Strike again. Now, that actually makes the move able to be used quite a bit more often, but because ultimately the goal there is just to kill the enemies and sort of keep them contained, most of the time you're going to be better off just actually throwing that into Element of Surprise, unless you have some particularly cheap and fun group strat where you're playing with other people and just keeping enemies locked down to a single area and trying to do that repeatedly. That said though, if you're trying to use Tempest Strike purely as crowd control, which is really the only reason to even consider Element of Renewal, seeing as Imperial Reach does so much more damage, just spammed, Element of Renewal just seems a little bit weak. I mean, I understand that if it was any stronger, that it would probably seem like it was kind of OP, but the move itself, Tempest Strike, just isn't quite as strong. Either way, again, not a bad Weaver in any regard, just the option to improve Imperial Reach is, again, just that strong. But that's going to be the tier 2 Weavers. We're going to move on to tier 3, and we get into some interesting stuff here too. So tier 3 Weavers with Yi-Lin, they're all pretty interesting to me. The first is Aspect of the Shadow. Yi-Lin drops aggro when she goes into her Jade Sentinel form. Now, the Jade Sentinel form by default has a damage reduction bonus, but this makes it so that enemies will stop targeting you as well, and that actually makes it really powerful at keeping you alive, because you can shift into Sentinel form to drop aggro if something scary is coming after you, and then when you feel it's safe or they're targeting something else, you just go back into your combat stance and murder whatever you can. It's an interesting thing, but I usually don't like aggro drops too much, just because they're kind of finicky, and holding aggro is part of keeping enemies out of the rift. It really has more to do with probably Endless. When you get to enemies that are at the point where they will one-shot you, you can drop the aggro just to keep yourself alive. But there's another Weaver that has some utility there that might need to be looked at too. So next we're going to move into Aspect of the Lotus. Aspect of the Lotus makes you bleed targets for more damage when you use White Tiger Strike. So White Tiger Strike causes that bleed, and while it's not super powerful on its own, this buffs it and brings it closer in line to something like Black Paw's wounding attack, his right click, but still not quite as strong. Granted, this only works for primary attacks too, and so that makes this Weaver, while interesting, particularly underwhelming, mainly because the only time you're at all using primary attacks is in the middle of spamming something that does way more damage or controls a crowd even better and will ultimately wind up dealing more damage. So it is not the best choice here almost any of the time, unless you just want to experiment with it or you need to deal some extra, fodder damage while you're learning the character in the earlier maps. But I probably wouldn't recommend it maybe 99% of the time. Maybe they'll release a weekly challenge that has some utility here someday, but as of right now, I'm probably going to say avoid Aspect of the Lotus almost all the time. Then we have Aspect of the Tiger. Now this is direct competition in Endless for Aspect of the Shadow, but also probably wins out the majority of the time, because this works Last I checked on everything in the game, including bosses. And what it does is you have a chance on your primary attack to kill anything above 75% health instantly. That means that a boss, you can one-shot. High health enemies, you can one-shot. It's not going to happen all the time, but a 10% chance is high enough that when the enemy HP gets significantly high, you will start to notice it because enemies start disappearing much sooner than you would expect them to. And that makes everything just a little bit easier for you, and actually means that Yi-Lin probably has some really choice synergies in Endless in teams. But overall, I think Aspect of the Shadow and Aspect of the Tiger are really good choices, especially Aspect of the Tiger. It's pretty much almost universally chosen at tier 3, I believe, with Aspect of the Shadow being a niche option if you happen to be dealing with some really tough enemies. But that's going to be tier 3. So Yi-Lin's tier 4 weavers aren't as spectacular as some of the other levels, but they're pretty solid at just diversifying your kit and adding things to it that don't already exist. So Blessing of Skill adds a slow to White Tiger Claw. I may have mentioned in previous videos that White Tiger Claw slowed on its own. I apologize for that if I have, but it does not until you receive this weaver. And it's the only slow that Yi-Lin has outside of, well, crowd control with Tempest Trike, which isn't a slow, it's a pull. But either way, this is a good choice to use if you have particularly fast enemies that you need to slow down, or you just feel that you need a little bit more crowd control to handle what's coming at you. The other two options at this level aren't going to do you anything super amazing, just because they can't be used quite as often and are effectively on a cooldown because of that. So it's a good choice, especially if you happen to be spamming the move against soldiers or the Frost Barbarians, you know, the Order minions and the Northern Ice versions of the Order minions. But other than that, you're probably going to want to steer clear of it if you need extra damage. If you're looking for damage, Blessing of Power is what you'll take, and it makes Tempest Strike deal bonus damage on each additional hit. You can get about, I think, 6 hits, or at least you get 3 or so spins from using the move, and I don't think it hits twice. I think it's just like a hit for everything that's near you after you pull it in. But either way, the bonus damage on the hits means that you're going to be doing additional damage overall, and because it pulls a large group in, and especially because it synergizes well with Imperial Reach, especially if you've taken Element of Surprise, it's going to be a really solid choice. Because it has a cooldown though, it's not really going to be mandatory. The extra speed reduction that you can get with Blessing of Skill does act well with her other abilities, and it is a much more spammable skill. So depending on how you like to play and your flow, it's probably going to be a very personal choice here, and that's completely okay. I mean, that's ultimately what the weavers are supposed to be. You know, do what works best for you, but really these are interchangeable almost at this point based on how you play. Then we have the Blessing of Health. The Blessing of Health is odd in my mind. The blessing itself doesn't do anything until you drop below 20% health. Yi-Lin's health pool is not huge, but when you drop below 20% health, you get a bonus to health and mana regeneration. It doesn't automatically refill your health and mana or your health like say Bianca's similar skill, which triggers at low health for her, but because she has Moon's Reflection, and it is automatically going to increase the healing or mana that you get. Well, it'll increase those naturally, but you also have your tier 1 weaver, Inspiring Moon or Healing Moon. Those bonuses will stack with it and ultimately just allow you to generate a ton of health and energy if it triggers. Now, if you don't tend to get the low health that often, then you really don't have to worry about it, and it really wouldn't make a good choice for you. But it's something that's there just in case you need a little bit of extra pick-me-up or you happen to be getting wailed on any particular time. But that's going to be her weavers. I'm going to say personally that it's a coin flip for me when I play Yi-Lin to either choose Inspiring Moon or Healing Moon. If I'm doing something where I know I'm going to need that bonus damage, Inspiring Moon is what I'm going to go for. Healing Moon is okay if I'm just looking to be tanky and I'm playing solo, just because enemies won't be dealing quite as much damage. And then I'm almost always going to be taking Element of Surprise, Aspect of the Tiger, and then Blessing of Power. Sometimes I'll switch to Blessing of Skill if I think I really need that slow, but with the combination of Yi-Lin's movement speed through her Jade Sentinel form, and just being able to deal quite a bit of damage with Imperial Reach, I really don't think Blessing of Skill is too useful. So that's going to be generally how I select the Weavers, but as always, you know, I've described them. Feel free to pick what works for you. So that is pretty much Yi-Lin in a nutshell. She is relatively fast, not the fastest, but better than average. Really strong, like she's one of the best short-range DPS characters that you will find in the game. She can be on par with Black Paw, if not better, in cases where you have large groups of enemies, and because she has a lot of attacks that do not have diminishing returns upon hitting large groups, that actually means that she scales a little bit better than some of the other melee heroes. And with Moon's Reflection, she's also going to be sustainable, so she's just an all-around really solid hero, and anybody picking her up probably won't be disappointed as long as they are okay with managing a very active play style. But let me know what you guys think. I mean, I've taken a while to actually put this out, and I apologize for that. Just some personal things I needed to take care of. But yeah, that is Yi-Lin, and I enjoy playing her, and I think she was a really great addition to the cast, and that's even besides the lore and everything else that she came with. She's probably one of the characters that alone, just because of them going into Chinese markets with orcs, probably added some of the more interesting aspects to the game. She came with a whole nother faction. I mean, that's just amazing. She's also really strong against that faction, so that's nice too. But that's gonna be it. You guys, let me know what you think. Feel free to drop a comment. Let me know. I think the next character that I'm supposed to start gameplays with is going to be Cygnus, so I am probably going to start firing him up when I get back into dropping the gameplay videos for you guys, and I may switch that format up a little bit just to get larger chunks of gameplay out there for you, and we'll see how it works. I don't know, still playing around with that stuff, but either way, thanks as always for tuning in. I sincerely appreciate it. Thankful that you guys are here, and I hope you guys are doing well as well. Until next time, as always, have a good one, folks.